I'm actually a little worried. It feels like, Bitcoin is currently about at its highest price ever in dollar terms and, close in many other currencies. But it is a sort of weird, like, are people actually using it? Like, blocks are sort of empty, sometimes sort of full. It's all these like ETFs and stuff. And actually, I'm here, for this interview, but also in San Francisco for a conference about post-quantum Bitcoin. And I'm kind of worried about that as well, because it feels like it could be another big controversial thing that divides a lot of people who work on Bitcoin. And hopefully it isn't. But yeah, so it's this kind of weird thing where it's like, I'm worried more about Bitcoin, despite it, like maybe from an external appearance being like, everything's great, like it's awesome, price goes up. So it's like, yeah, we still haven't really solved scalability and long-term fees and post-quantum and all these things. So I guess top of mind is, how do we like not get complacent? Or how do we like translate this to getting more people on board to working on it, rather than just sort of like party, ossification, everything's great. So that's what I think about a lot.
Yes, you're here for the Quantum Bitcoin Summit, which kicks off in a couple hours.
Hour or two, yeah.
We got here early to get this in beforehand. Yeah, and so that is clearly top of mind for you and lots of other people working on like a diverse range of things. And so I saw you recently proposed a quantum resistance upgrade.
Yeah.
Maybe in layman's terms for our listeners, if that's possible, can you kind of talk a little bit more about what that's about?
Sure. So I think the goal of it is basically have something where your coins can be safe today, without almost any changes to Bitcoin. You still, so I came up, like I haven't posted it yet, but I came up with a catchy name for it, Lifeboat. Where it's like, okay, like it's not the way you get around, but if your main thing stops working, you have a lifeboat, right? You're okay. And you can sort of get around with that. But the main idea is you can use a sort of commit reveal scheme where your Bitcoins normally are secured by your private key. And it's like, not your keys, not your coins. Like this key is the most important thing. But most Bitcoins are protected by another thing called pay to pub key hash. So you don't actually post your direct pub key, you post the hash. The quantum computer, in theory, would break this sort of private key, in that if it sees a public key, it can get the private key. But it cannot, from a hash, get the public key. So you sort of still have a secret. It's just that now your secret is your public key, and you can kind of use that to move Bitcoin around. It's not good, right? It's like way worse. But it is a way to say like, hey, you don't have to panic. Like if this actually does happen, you can still move your coins. Your coins are basically safe, but it's slower and it's sort of awkward and you need to change the software. But it's like, you don't have to do anything right now. It's not like, oh, everyone needs to upgrade, everyone needs to migrate. So it's a sort of like reassuring, like, here's how we can deal with this if this problem happens.
So is this something that you think developers should mainly be thinking about, or will end users and I guess wallets also be effective and have to do something?
Yeah, I guess it's mostly developers. I think if there's one sort of takeaway for average, people who are not programming it but like Bitcoin and use it, is don't reuse addresses. That's the one. I mean, that's already been something developers have sort of said forever. Like, hey, just use an address once. But I totally understand that like people, it's inconvenient and doesn't always work. But as far as I know, most of the quantum recovery schemes work a lot better if you haven't used addresses more than once. So if you like it, to be technical, it's if you receive multiple payments on the same address, that doesn't really break it. But it's if you've received, then sent and like spent those coins and then received again. That means the public key is now, broadcast to everyone. So that's sort of a problem. So basically the only takeaway for users is like, and this is a lot of times wallet software also has to implement it, is, don't try not to use addresses more than once. That's like the safest.
Maybe again, in layman's terms, just we have a broad range of listeners, kind of even talk about why we're even really concerned about quantum computers in the first place.
Right. So it's kind of weird because like I'm not super, like my personal opinion is like, this is probably not going to happen, but I do worry that there's enough people that think it will, that it could be a problem. So the idea is Bitcoin is secured by sort of two things. There's the proof of work, which is like hash functions. And then there's the signatures, which are elliptic curve signatures. And, if you're not familiar with these, they seem like, okay, they're both these sort of math things. if you really look at it, the hash functions aren't really math. They're just sort of like these random, like, hey, take this number and then swap it with that number and then like, shuffle it around and then look at it backwards. And they're like, there's no real mathematical theory behind it. It's kind of like, it's fun and it seems to work, but it's like, okay, that works. And then there's the elliptic curve signatures, which are sort of more like fancy math. The problem is there's this area of research called quantum computing, where it's like, hey, if we make this special kind of computer, which we haven't really gotten to work yet, it could break the elliptic curve signatures. The idea that like right now with elliptic curves, you have a private key, which is just a random number. You essentially multiply it by this point on a curve, which is this complicated sort of, graph thing. And then you have a public key. And the idea is no one can figure out your private key from your public key. But one of the things that a quantum computer can do is figure out your private key from your public key. And this is a paper by a researcher named Shor's. It's called Shor's algorithm from like 1994. And so everyone's sort of known forever, for far before Bitcoin was even invented, that if a quantum computer existed, yeah, all this ECDSA stuff, all this RSA stuff, it would all be broken. It wouldn't be useful anymore. But it hasn't mattered because these computers don't exist. And so I've talked to people for years who are like, hey, what about quantum computers? And most Bitcoin people have sort of dismissed it. For some reason, it's gotten more popular in the last couple years, 2 years maybe. And I think there's maybe some progress in like research. I'm like, oh, we're making, getting closer to making these things. I'm still pretty skeptical that it will happen any time in the next 10, 20, 30 years. It seems very far off. But it is a risk. It's sort of like, well, if it happened and it just breaks all keys, like that's kind of the end of Bitcoin. Like, what do? We should have a plan, right? Because even if I think there's only a 1% chance of this happening in the next 10 years, well, multiply Bitcoin's, whatever it is, 2 trillion times 1%. Okay, that's still like a ton of money. It's like still very worth, making sure that even the somewhat unlikely problems are dealt with. Because like that's sort of all of Bitcoin. Like, I don't know, if you run Bitcoin and you have a full node with all the blocks, you still have like almost 200 gigabytes of these rev files. It's only there for reorgs. It's never going to happen. And like, like half the code in Lightning Network is dealing with like justice transactions, and they like never happen. So it's sort of like, yeah, most of Bitcoin is working on these like scenarios that never happen to make sure that they don't screw things up.
Do you have any dream projects that you would like to see somebody build?
I think one of the big ones is like, okay, we still need to work on usability. And then I guess other dream that I think would be cool, which people might disagree, I think client diversity is a good thing. Like, I think part of the idea in Bitcoin is like, it's open source. That doesn't just mean you can like look at the code. It means you can write the whole thing from scratch if you want. And I know a lot of people say like, no, that's a bad idea. Don't do this. But I feel like long term, it shouldn't just be, core, where it's like a group of people that work on this one software project, because you don't want to be seen as in control. And so I feel like as it gets more bigger and like more political and government starts saying like, hey, what is Bitcoin? Like, maybe we want to regulate this because that's what we do. I think it would be better if there were multiple implementations that were actually used. Because then it's easier to sort of say like, well, we would just work on this software, right? But if it's 99% of the nodes run this software, it's a sort of point where people can say, hey, why don't you change your software? So that's sort of a dream project that maybe someday there will be like a several competitive and like, very compatible like implementations. We have BTCD and like people work on that, and I think it's cool. But it's, right now it's sort of Bitcoin Core is the one the best one that has all the mindshare, which is like, it makes sense. But as it gets bigger, like, yeah, maybe we could have all the other implementations. So I know people disagree, but yeah.
Well, we'll see what happens. Yep. Things have changed a lot since you've been in the space. So you're at MIT's Digital Currency Initiative. How do you think, which does a great job of funding, that we can better support open source developers? What can companies or universities do that's helpful?
It's so the funding in open source landscape's like way better than it used to be. One of the things I'm looking at is like education. So, and that's one of the things I wonder about too, is if there are people who are interested in this, like all around the world, are universities the best way, or is like some kind of online thing or in person? So I guess here Presidio Bitcoin has, a lot of people coming. But yeah, like how to get people educated and involved in like building these things. And it's not that there's no one doing this. There's tons of people doing it, but I think it's still really important that like either students or people who are already, working on computer stuff learn how it works. And also like education for people who might not be programmers but want to know how this stuff works. So I like a cool story is like my dad didn't buy Bitcoin, and I was like, tell him, hey, the Bitcoin. And then he's like, I don't understand it, so I'm not going to buy it, which is like, okay. And then he sort of retired. He still works part-time. He sort of retired. And then I saw him at like Thanksgiving. He's like, so how do they determine the generator point of the elliptic curve? I'm like, whoa, okay. So, and then he like bought some Bitcoin, right? Because he's like, I get it now. Like, learn about it. So I think that's a big part, as you don't want, or I think it's a little dangerous if you have a huge user base that doesn't really know about how it works, right? They're just like, oh, it's Bitcoin. You just buy ETFs or buy MicroStrategy and it goes up and you make money. It's like, okay, but I think it's a lot sort of safer and more robust if you have a lot of people who are like, oh, it's Bitcoin, and maybe I'm not a programmer, but like I've heard of that, like I've heard of this is how this works, and I like have some understanding and run software. So I think even education for people who may not be developers but just users is also important. Bitcoin is what people think it is. So if you think, oh, it's totally safe, it's totally fine, like it can be redefined, and I think that's one of the scariest parts and also most powerful parts. So it's you determine what Bitcoin is. So to that extent, like know what it is and know what you want it to do. And you may be faced with choices in the future of what Bitcoin is. Like that happened sort of with forks back in 2017. I wouldn't be surprised if that continues to happen as it gets bigger. So it's really up to everyone who has Bitcoin and uses it to like determine its future.